In this episode, we take the big idea of risk management and make it more concrete by learning how to map where AI risks actually come from. When beginners hear about AI risk, it is easy to imagine a single danger living inside the model, as if the model itself is either safe or unsafe. In real use, risk is distributed across the entire system around the model, including the data it learns from, the way it is deployed, the people who use it, and the environment it operates in. That is why risk mapping matters, because it helps you stop thinking in vague terms and start locating specific points where harm can happen. Once you can point to where risk originates, it becomes much easier to choose controls that actually reduce it. The goal is to build a mental map that stays useful even when the tools change, because the categories of risk are stable even if the technology evolves. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A practical way to begin is to think of an AI system as a chain, where each link can introduce failure and where a weak link can break the safety of the whole. The data link includes what information is collected, how it is labeled, how it is cleaned, and what it represents about the real world. The model link includes how the system learns patterns, what it prioritizes, and what it cannot understand or guarantee. The deployment link includes where the system runs, who can access it, and how it is monitored and updated. The user link includes how people interpret outputs, how much they trust them, and how they may misuse them under pressure. The environment link includes the surrounding context, such as regulations, adversaries, changing conditions, and organizational incentives that shape behavior. Risk mapping is the practice of examining each link with a disciplined mindset, asking what could go wrong here, how likely it is, and what the impact could be. When you map risks this way, you move from general fear to specific awareness. Data is often the most influential risk source because data is the foundation that shapes what the system learns and how it behaves. If the data is incomplete, the system may confidently perform well in common situations but fail badly on less common situations, which can harm the people who fall into those edges. If the data reflects historical unfairness, the system can learn patterns that repeat those unfair outcomes, even if nobody intended discrimination. If the data includes sensitive personal information, the organization can create privacy exposure simply by collecting or reusing data in ways that were not authorized. Beginners should also understand that data risk includes how data is handled, not just what it contains. A dataset can be perfectly appropriate in theory, but risky in practice if it is stored insecurely, shared improperly, or retained longer than needed. When mapping data risk, you should look at origin, purpose, sensitivity, quality, representativeness, and governance, because those characteristics predict where harm could emerge. Data risk also includes a subtle problem that beginners often miss, which is that data can change without anyone noticing, and those changes can silently alter system behavior. A system might rely on a source that is updated daily, or it might pull information from different systems as the business evolves. When the data shifts, the patterns the system learned may no longer match reality, which can cause errors that look random but are actually systematic. Another data risk is leakage, where data that should never be part of training or prompts ends up included because people do not recognize it as sensitive. That can happen when users paste information into a tool for convenience or when developers combine datasets without clear boundaries. Data risk mapping, therefore, includes looking at who can add data, who can modify it, and who can access it, because those are common pathways for mistakes and misuse. If you can trace data lineage and ownership, you can detect changes and enforce boundaries more reliably. When you cannot trace lineage, you are often flying blind, and that blindness becomes risk. Model risk is the second major category, and it includes both how the model behaves and how people misunderstand its behavior. Models are pattern learners, not truth engines, which means they can generate outputs that sound correct while being incorrect or inappropriate for the context. Models can also be brittle, meaning they perform well under familiar conditions but struggle when inputs shift, when users phrase requests differently, or when unusual cases appear. Beginners sometimes assume the model's accuracy in testing is the whole story, but the model's behavior in production can be different because real inputs are messier and more diverse. Model risk can also include the risk of hidden correlations, where the model uses signals that seem predictive but are actually proxies for sensitive traits or unfair patterns. Another model risk is ambiguity about what the model is optimized for, because a model optimized for speed or engagement may produce outputs that are not aligned with safety or fairness. Mapping model risk means asking what the model can reliably do, what it cannot do, where it is likely to fail, and how those failures could translate into harm. Model risk also includes what you might call the illusion of certainty, which is the tendency for model outputs to feel authoritative even when they are not. This illusion is dangerous because it changes human behavior, leading people to skip verification or to accept suggestions without healthy skepticism. Beginners should recognize that confidence in language is not the same as correctness, and that model outputs must be treated as signals, not final decisions, especially in high-impact contexts. Model risk can also show up as inconsistency, where the same input produces different outputs at different times, making it harder to build reliable processes around the system. Another risk is that model behavior can be influenced by how it is instructed or guided, which means small changes in prompts or configuration can shift outcomes. If those changes are not controlled, the model can drift into behaviors that were never approved. Mapping model risk, therefore, includes understanding the system's limitations, sensitivity to input changes, and stability over time, because those factors determine how much oversight is needed in production. Deployment risk is the third category, and it is where many security and compliance issues become real. Deployment includes where the system runs, which networks it touches, how it integrates with other systems, and how it is accessed by users and administrators. A deployment might be secure on paper, but risky in practice if access control is weak, if logs are missing, or if updates happen without review. Beginners should also understand that deployment risk includes the risk of misconfiguration, which can expose data or allow unintended use. For example, a system might be intended for internal use, but a misconfiguration could make it accessible more broadly, changing both likelihood and impact of harm. Deployment risk also includes the operational processes around the system, such as how changes are approved, how versions are tracked, and how monitoring is performed. If deployment processes are inconsistent, the organization may not be able to prove what version of a system was running during an incident. Mapping deployment risk means examining access, integration points, monitoring, change control, and operational resilience, because that is where many preventable failures occur. Deployment risk also includes the relationship with third parties, because many AI capabilities rely on external services, libraries, or providers. When a system sends data to an external provider, new risks appear, such as contract compliance, cross-border data handling, and reduced visibility into how the provider manages security. Even when the provider is reputable, the organization still needs to manage its own obligations, such as limiting what data is shared and ensuring appropriate approvals exist. Another deployment risk is over-permissioning, where too many people have administrator access, increasing the chance of mistakes or misuse. A further deployment risk is inadequate monitoring, where the organization cannot detect abnormal usage patterns, unexpected outputs, or data leakage. Beginners should see that deployment is not a one-time event, because systems live and change, and each change is a chance to introduce new risk. Mapping deployment risk therefore requires thinking about day-to-day operation, not just initial launch, because production safety depends on ongoing discipline. User risk is the fourth category, and it is often underestimated because people focus on the technology while forgetting that humans complete the system. Users can create risk through misunderstanding, overtrust, misuse, and inconsistent application of outputs. A system might be designed as decision support, but users might treat it as decision replacement when they are busy or stressed. A system might be intended for drafting, but users might publish outputs without review because the writing sounds polished. Users can also create data risk by sharing sensitive information in prompts or by using unapproved tools because they are convenient. Beginners should notice that user risk is not about blaming individuals, but about designing governance that anticipates normal human behavior. People take shortcuts when processes are slow, and they rely on tools when they feel pressure to perform. Mapping user risk means identifying how different user roles interact with the system, what decisions they make with it, what mistakes are likely, and what incentives could push them toward risky behavior. If you understand user pathways, you can design training, guardrails, and oversight that reduce harm without assuming perfect behavior. User risk also includes the risk of shadow use, where teams adopt AI tools outside official governance because they do not want to wait for approvals or they do not realize rules apply. Shadow use is dangerous because it reduces visibility, and without visibility, risk cannot be managed consistently. Another user risk is skill mismatch, where users do not know how to evaluate outputs, do not know what limitations exist, and do not know when to escalate concerns. This is especially common for beginners and new hires, but it can also occur when a new AI tool is introduced and people assume it behaves like an older tool. User risk mapping should therefore consider training coverage, awareness timing, and the clarity of escalation paths. It should also consider the kinds of tasks users perform, because tasks that involve high-impact decisions require stronger oversight than tasks that involve low-impact assistance. When user risk is mapped well, the organization can place friction in the right places, such as requiring review for sensitive outputs, without making every use case unnecessarily difficult. Environment risk is the fifth category, and it describes the external and contextual forces that shape how the system behaves and how it is perceived. The environment includes laws and regulations, which can change and create new obligations even if the system itself has not changed. It includes threat actors, who may try to exploit systems, manipulate inputs, or extract sensitive information. It includes public expectations, where a practice that seems acceptable internally may be viewed as harmful or deceptive by customers or regulators. It also includes organizational pressures like competition, deadlines, and leadership priorities, which can push teams towards speed and reduce caution. Beginners should understand that environment risk is not fully controllable, but it is predictable enough to plan for. If a system operates in a heavily regulated area, environment risk is higher because the consequences of failure can be severe. If a system is exposed to untrusted users, environment risk is higher because misuse and manipulation are more likely. Mapping environment risk means identifying the external forces that could change the risk landscape and ensuring governance has a way to adapt. Environment risk also includes the reality that AI systems do not operate in a vacuum because they interact with other systems, processes, and social contexts. A model might perform well in isolation but create harm when integrated into a workflow that assumes outputs are always correct. A model might be safe when used by trained staff, but risky when exposed to broad populations with different needs and vulnerabilities. Environment also includes changes in data sources, market conditions, and user behavior that can shift the system's context. Beginners should pay attention to how environment risk connects to drift, because drift is often triggered by environmental change, not by deliberate design choices. Another environment factor is the level of scrutiny an organization faces, because high-profile organizations may be held to higher expectations and face greater reputational impact from mistakes. Mapping environment risk means stepping back and asking what could change around the system that would make previously acceptable behavior unacceptable. That perspective is crucial for long-term governance. Once you have these 5 categories, the real skill is connecting them, because risks rarely stay inside one box. A data problem can become a model behavior problem, which becomes a user decision problem, which becomes a deployment incident, which becomes a regulatory problem in the environment. For example, poor data quality can lead to unreliable outputs, which users may overtrust, resulting in harmful decisions that trigger complaints and external scrutiny. Similarly, a deployment misconfiguration can expose data, which creates privacy harm, which creates legal and reputational impact. Beginners should see that mapping is not about labeling risks. It is about tracing pathways across the system. When you trace a pathway, you can identify where to intervene most effectively, such as improving data governance, strengthening access control, adding monitoring, or adjusting user training. The purpose of mapping is to design risk treatment that matches the true source and pathway of harm. If you treat the wrong part, risk remains, and governance becomes performative rather than effective. A practical outcome of risk mapping is building a consistent habit of asking the right questions at the right time. When a new AI use case is proposed, you ask data questions like what sources are used and whether they are appropriate. You ask model questions like what limitations exist and what failure modes matter. You ask deployment questions like who will access it and how changes will be controlled. You ask user questions like how outputs will be used and what training is required. You ask environment questions like what obligations apply and what external threats exist. Beginners should notice that this habit scales well because it does not depend on any specific technology brand or model type. It depends on categories of risk that exist across AI systems. This habit also helps avoid the trap of focusing on what is easiest to measure, like model accuracy, while ignoring what is harder but more important, like misuse pathways and high-impact outcomes. Risk mapping is therefore a prioritization tool as much as an analysis tool. The final takeaway is that mapping AI risks across data, model, deployment, users, and environment is a way to make risk management specific, actionable, and resilient over time. Data mapping helps you see how quality, sensitivity, and lineage shape behavior and compliance exposure. Model mapping helps you understand limitations, failure modes, and the illusion of certainty that can drive over trust. Deployment mapping helps you control access, integration, monitoring, and change processes that often determine whether risk is detected and contained. User mapping helps you anticipate misunderstandings, shortcuts, and shadow use, and it guides training and guardrails that match real behavior. Environment mapping helps you account for changing obligations, adversaries, and contextual shifts that can raise risk even when the system seems unchanged. When you combine these perspectives, you create a richer picture of where harm can originate and how it can spread, which is the foundation for choosing controls that actually reduce likelihood and impact in the real world.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.